I never thought I'd end up in a courtroom listening to strangers decide whether I was still allowed to think for myself. But there I was, 74 years old, sitting in a wheelchair I didn't need, wearing a cardigan someone else had picked out for me, while a lawyer I'd met twice stood up and told a judge I was confused and no longer capable of managing my own affairs. I remember staring at my hands in my lap, thinking about how quiet a room can get right before it changes forever. That was when my granddaughter Mia stood up. She hadn't asked permission. She hadn't waited for her turn. She just rose out of her chair, holding a plain manila folder like it weighed nothing and everything at the same time, and said, "Your Honor, before this hearing continues, I think everyone needs to see what my grandfather's bank actually shows online." I watched my daughter Denise go pale in her seat. I watched the judge's eyebrows lift just slightly, the way people's do when they sense the room is about to tilt. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. 6 months earlier, I didn't know any of this was coming. I didn't know I had a hidden inheritance waiting for me, one my late wife had quietly arranged years before she died. I didn't know my own daughter had already decided what my life was worth in dollars. And I certainly didn't know that the person who would end up saving me wasn't a lawyer, or a friend, or even one of my own children. It was a 17-year-old girl with a laptop, a library card, and a stubborn refusal to believe the story everyone else had already accepted about me. But to understand how we got to that courtroom, I have to take you back to the beginning, back before any of this started. Let me back up. 8 months before that courtroom, my life looked nothing like a legal battle. It looked like birdseed on the back porch and coffee that had gone cold because I'd gotten distracted talking to the cardinals outside my kitchen window. My wife Eleanor had passed that spring, and the house we'd raised our daughter in had gotten quieter than I ever imagined a house could get. I kept things simple. I fed the birds every morning. I ate the same breakfast I'd eaten for 30 years. And every Sunday at 6 o'clock, without fail, my granddaughter Mia called me. Not because anyone told her to, but because she wanted to. She was the only one who still asked how I was really doing, not the polite version of the question people ask when they already expect a fine. Up in my closet, on the shelf where Eleanor used to keep her sewing things, sat an old tan tackle box. I never thought much of it. If anyone had asked, I'd have called it junk. Old fishing lures and spools of thread, nothing worth mentioning. I had no idea how wrong I was about that box or how much it would come to matter. My daughter Denise visited often that year, always with groceries, always with a plan. She'd sit at my kitchen table and go through my mail, sighing at the clutter of it all. One afternoon she said, "Dad, let me take some of this paperwork off your plate now that Mom's gone. You've got enough to deal with." I was grieving and tired and grateful someone wanted to help carry the weight. So I signed the papers she brought me. I thought I was making things easier for everyone. I had no idea what that one signature would end up costing me. What I didn't know, sitting at that kitchen table signing papers, was what was happening in Denise's life outside of my house. My daughter was 46 years old, a real estate agent who'd sunk money into an investment property that had gone bad, and she was drowning in debt she'd never once mentioned to me. Her husband Craig had opinions about that debt and about me. I heard later, from someone who was there, that he'd said to her one night, "Your dad's got money just sitting there doing nothing. You're the one who does everything for him. Why shouldn't that count for something?" Denise didn't argue with him. She started finding reasons to consolidate things for me, moving small amounts here and there, telling herself it was temporary, telling herself she'd put it back. Meanwhile, Mia was the one who actually paid attention. She'd visit on weekends and notice things nobody else seemed to catch. She noticed I could remember every detail of a fishing trip from 1988, but somehow couldn't remember signing a document from 3 weeks earlier. My memory was sharp as ever when I was with her. It only ever seemed to go foggy around paperwork Denise had put in front of me. At a family dinner that spring, I heard Denise tell my sister, "Dad's really struggling since Mom passed. I'm just trying to protect him." Everyone nodded. Everyone believed her. It was a kind lie, the kind that sounds like love from across a dinner table. I didn't know yet that a story was being written about me, one I hadn't agreed to and wouldn't recognize as my own. I didn't recognize it as a pattern at first. I thought each thing was its own, small, separate decision. Looking back, I can see now it was never separate. It was a staircase, and I was being walked down it one polite step at a time. The first step was my truck, a dependable old Ford I'd driven for 11 years, the same one I used to haul firewood and take Mia fishing when she was small enough to need a boost into the passenger seat. One week, it was in my driveway. The next week, it wasn't. Denise told me she'd sold it for my safety, said something about my reflexes not being what they used to be, said it so calmly that I almost thanked her for thinking of me. It was only after, sitting in my kitchen with no way to get to the hardware store or the diner I'd gone to every Thursday for 15 years, that I understood what I'd actually lost wasn't just a vehicle. It was the last piece of my independence, taken from me without a single conversation. The second step happened in front of people I loved. We were at my sister's house for a family gathering, and I was telling a story about the summer Eleanor and I drove up to the lake with a leaking cooler and ruined every sandwich we'd packed. It was a story I'd told 100 times, one that always got a laugh. Denise cut me off in the middle of it, right in front of the cousins and the grandchildren, and said, "Dad, that's not quite how it happened. Remember, your memory's not great now." The room went quiet in a different way than laughter quiet. I felt my face go warm. I didn't argue, I just nodded and let the rest of the story die in my throat, because arguing would have proven her point better than staying silent ever could. The third step was the one that broke something in me. Denise sat me down and explained, gently, reasonably, that the house had to be sold to cover the cost of my care going forward. She said it like it was inevitable, like a weather report. What she didn't say, what I wouldn't learn until much later, was that most of the money from that sale never went toward any care at all. It went somewhere else entirely. I moved into a facility with beige walls and a single window that looked out onto a parking lot. A room about the size of my old pantry, in a building that smelled like disinfectant and canned soup. When Mia came to visit me there for the first time, I watched her face change the moment she stepped through the door. She looked around at the bare walls, at the narrow bed, at the complete absence of anything that had ever belonged to me, and she asked where my things were. My tools, my photographs, Eleanor's old tackle box. I told her I didn't know. Nobody had asked me what I wanted to keep. Things had simply been packed, and things had simply disappeared. While Mia was there, one of the aides mentioned, almost in passing, that Denise hadn't updated my account information in months, that there were forms sitting unfinished that someone really ought to get to. Mia didn't say much in response. She just went quiet in the way people go quiet when they're filing something away for later. That evening, after she'd gone, I sat alone in that small room, and I thought about the house I'd built a family in, the porch I'd fed birds from every morning for years, and how far away all of that suddenly felt from 4 beige walls and a window facing a parking lot. Mia called before she left the parking lot, just to check on me one more time, and I told her the only thing I had left to say. I told her, "I don't need much, sweetheart. I just wish someone had asked me first." Dignity, I've come to understand, isn't taken from a person all at once. It's taken in small, polite pieces, each one easy to explain away on its own. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar room, I told myself it was just a rough patch, that things would settle, that Denise had my best interests at heart even if her methods felt cold. I had no idea it was only the beginning. Mia couldn't let it go. A few days after that visit, she called me not for our usual Sunday check-in, but specifically to ask about the tackle box. I remember feeling almost embarrassed by how much I didn't know. I told her that Eleanor had always said it was meant for the grandkids someday, that there was something important tucked inside it, something we'd hidden together years before she got sick. But when Mia pressed me for details, my mind came up empty. I told her, honestly, that I couldn't remember exactly what it was, only that it mattered, and that Denise had boxed up most of the closet before the move without asking me what to keep. I heard something shift in Mia's voice when I said that. She went quiet for a moment, then asked carefully whether I thought the box could have been thrown out by accident. I said, maybe. I didn't want to consider the other possibility out loud, the one where it hadn't been an accident at all. That night, unable to sleep, Mia did what she always did when something bothered her. She started digging. Years earlier, back when I was first getting used to a computer Eleanor had bought me, I used to forward Mia every email that confused me, figuring she'd know what to do with it better than I did. Most of those old emails were nothing, forgotten clutter sitting in an inbox nobody had opened in years. But scrolling back through them that night, Mia found something that stopped her cold. A decade-old thread, buried among grocery coupons and appointment reminders, mentioning a name she didn't recognize. A law office, something about estate planning documents tied to Eleanor. She told me later that she almost closed the laptop and went to bed. It looked, at first glance, like nothing. Old business, long since settled, but the name kept nagging at her, the way a loose thread does when you know pulling it might unravel something bigger than you expected. She said she thought she was just being nosy, just chasing a small mystery to distract herself from how unsettled that visit had left her. She had no idea she was about to find out that her grandmother had quietly planned for exactly this moment, years before any of us knew it was coming. By the time she closed her laptop that night, she'd already written the attorney's name down on a scrap of paper, and she couldn't stop thinking about it. Mia didn't stop at one name in an old email. Once she had that scrap of paper, she went looking for whatever it might connect to, and it didn't take long before she learned that a lot of what she needed wasn't hidden at all. It was sitting in public probate and trust registries, the kind of records anyone can search if they know where to look and are patient enough to sift through them. She told me later she expected to find nothing. Maybe an old will, some outdated paperwork nobody bothered to update. Instead, she found a filed trust document, years old, with Eleanor's signature on it, and mine right beside hers. It named me as trustee. It named Mia and her cousins as the ultimate beneficiaries. And buried in the legal language was a clear intention, one Eleanor had put in writing long before she ever got sick, designed specifically to prevent anyone, family or otherwise, from taking control of what was meant to pass directly to the grandchildren. Mia said that was the moment she finally understood something about me that had confused her for months. Even while I was losing my house, my truck, my privacy, some small part of me had stayed strangely calm through all of it. She used to wonder how I could be so composed while everything around me was falling apart. Now she knew. Some part of me had always trusted that Eleanor had built something sturdier than whatever Denise was doing to unravel it, even if I couldn't remember the details myself. She kept digging. In a separate public court filing related to Denise's failed investment property, Mia found banking records that had been entered as evidence in an unrelated dispute. Buried in those records were deposits, dates, and amounts that lined up almost exactly with withdrawals missing from my own accounts. Denise had been so confident that money moved quietly between accounts would stay buried forever. She never imagined that a completely separate legal mess would leave a trail leading right back to her. Mia called the trust attorney's office the next morning. She told me she'd rehearsed what she was going to say for nearly an hour before she worked up the nerve to dial. The attorney listened asked a few careful questions, and then went quiet for a moment before saying that, yes, the documents were genuine, and yes, given what Mia had described, it was serious enough to warrant filing for an emergency guardianship review. She came to see me that same week, printouts in hand, and laid them out on the little table in my beige room. I looked at Eleanor's signature, at my own name listed as trustee, and something in my memory finally loosened. I told Mia the tackle box had never held fishing lures at all, not really. It held our original signed copy, the backup Eleanor and I had hidden away years ago in case anything ever happened to the official file. Your grandmother always said, I told her, that doors close quietly before they open loudly. I think this is what she meant. I thought, for months, that I had simply lost track of an old keepsake. I had no idea I had actually been sitting on my grandmother's last act of protection, waiting patiently for someone to go looking for it. With the attorney now involved, a hearing was scheduled within weeks, and that is how I ended up back where this story began, sitting in a wheelchair I didn't need, in a courtroom I never expected to see the inside of. So, there we were, back in that courtroom, the same one I described at the very start of all this. My aunt and cousin sat scattered through the benches, having believed for months that I was slipping, that Denise was simply doing what any devoted daughter would do. Craig sat a few rows back, jaw tight, saying nothing. Denise's lawyer stood beside her, confident, prepared to close out what he clearly expected to be a routine hearing, and I sat in that wheelchair, hands folded, waiting. Mia stood up first. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. With the attorney beside her for support, she walked the folder up to the judge and began laying out what she'd found, one document at a time. The trust Eleanor had filed years earlier, naming me trustee, naming the grandchildren as beneficiaries, written specifically, deliberately, to prevent anyone from doing exactly what had been done to me. Then the bank records, the transfers, the dates that lined up so precisely with the missing funds that there was no room left for coincidence. Denise's lawyer objected, said the documents needed context, said they could be misread. But the judge was already reading them herself, and I watched her expression change as the numbers added up in front of her in real time. Paper doesn't need to raise its voice to be believed. It just needs to be read carefully by someone willing to look. Denise's composure started to slip. She said she'd only been managing things, that she'd intended to pay it all back eventually, that nobody understood how hard it had been to handle everything alone since her mother died. But the numbers on the page didn't leave room for intention. They only showed what had actually happened, transfer by transfer, month by month, and no amount of explaining could talk them back into being something else. The judge turned to me then and asked gently if I wanted to say anything. I felt the whole room settle into a different kind of quiet, the kind that happens right before something true gets said out loud. I stood up out of that wheelchair, the one I had never once actually needed, and I felt every eye in that room shift toward me, waiting to see whether the confused old man they'd been told about would finally show himself. I told them the truth, plainly, the way Eleanor always taught me to say things that mattered. I didn't lose my mind, I said. I lost my trust in the one person I thought I would never have to question. You don't have to be loud to be right, I told that room. You just have to be ready. Nobody spoke after that. My sister looked down at her hands. My cousins wouldn't meet my eyes. Craig stared at the floor like he'd known longer than anyone was willing to admit. The people who had nodded along with Denise's story for months, who had watched me lose my truck and my house and my dignity without asking a single hard question, sat in that silence and understood exactly what their silence had cost me. The judge didn't waste time. She ordered an immediate freeze on Denise's access to any remaining accounts and scheduled a full hearing to reverse the guardianship entirely, effective as soon as the paperwork could be filed. Denise sat very still in her chair, smaller somehow than she'd looked walking in that morning, while I stood taller than I had in months. Nobody in that courtroom said another word as the judge gathered her papers and the room began slowly to empty out. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different than it had going in. My sister was the first to reach me, her eyes red, saying she was sorry, that she should have asked more questions, that she just believed what she was told because it was easier than doubting her own niece. My cousins said similar things, in their own stumbling ways, each apology a little more uncomfortable than the last, because each one was really an admission of how long they'd looked away. Craig hung back near the parking lot, hands in his pockets, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. When he finally spoke to me, it wasn't really an apology. It was closer to an excuse. He said he'd had a feeling something wasn't right for a while now, that he just hadn't wanted to get involved in what felt like Denise's business to handle. I didn't say much back. There wasn't much left to say to a man who'd known and chosen silence anyway. Denise stood a little apart from everyone, cornered by relatives who wanted answers she didn't seem ready to give. One moment, she insisted she'd only ever meant to pay it all back, that none of it was as bad as the paperwork made it look. The next moment, something in her face would crack open, just slightly, into something that looked almost like real shame. I watched her the way you watch weather change, unsure which version of her was going to settle in for good. Mia and I stepped away from all of it and sat down together on the courthouse steps. I had the tackle box with me by then, recovered from wherever it had been stashed during the move, a little scuffed, but otherwise exactly as I remembered it. I opened it slowly, right there in front of her, some part of me finally ready to see what was inside. Underneath the old lures and spools of thread sat Eleanor's wedding ring, and folded beneath it, a small handwritten note in her familiar looping script. For the one who never stopped asking questions, it said. I looked up at Mia, and I watched it land on her exactly the way it had landed on me. That note had never been meant for just anyone. It had been waiting, patiently, for her. I thought, when all of this started, that I'd simply found some old paperwork tucked away in a closet. I had no idea my grandmother had been waiting years, quietly, patiently, for me to become exactly the kind of person who would need to go looking for it in the first place. We sat there a while longer, not saying much, the two of us, while behind us the rest of the family kept working through their own uncomfortable reckoning. Something had cracked open that day, and it was going to take a lot more than one afternoon on a courthouse step to see what would grow back in its place. The guardianship reversal became official a few weeks later, quietly, in a courtroom far less dramatic than the first one. No cameras, no gasps, just a judge signing papers that gave me my life back on record. Not long after, with a portion of the recovered trust assets finally released, I moved into a small apartment not far from Mia. It wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. It had a window that looked out onto a real street instead of a parking lot. And it had my own things in it again. The ones that had survived, plus whatever new ones I chose to gather. Denise didn't go to prison. The court ordered restitution instead, a repayment schedule stretched out over years, along with mandated counseling and probation. It wasn't nothing, and it wasn't everything either. It sat somewhere in between, which felt oddly like the most honest outcome any of us could have asked for. At first, the restitution payments came exactly the way you'd expect from someone doing the bare minimum a court required. Small amounts, always on time, never a word attached to them. I didn't expect much more than that. But a few months in, something shifted. Denise showed up alone one Sunday evening to dinner at my apartment. The same dinners Mia and I had started having together most weeks. She didn't ask to be forgiven. She didn't make a speech. She simply walked into the kitchen, found the plates, and set the table without being asked. Something I honestly couldn't remember her ever doing before in her adult life. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even particularly warm. But it was real in a way her old reassurances never had been. She used to hand me polished words about protecting me, about handling things, about knowing what was best. Those words had always come easily and cost her nothing. This, the quiet act of setting a table without an audience to perform for, cost her something. I noticed the difference immediately. Mia and I started our own ritual around that same time. Every Sunday, before dinner, we'd sit together and open Eleanor's old tackle box, the one that had once held nothing but lures and thread and, eventually, the papers that saved my life. We began adding small things to it, a photograph, a ticket stub, a note Mia had written to her future self. It stopped being a container for one secret and started becoming something more like a family record, added to a little at a time, week after week. One evening, watching Mia carefully tuck a folded drawing into the box beside Eleanor's ring, I told her something I'd been turning over in my mind for weeks. "Your grandmother protected us with paper," I said. "You protected me with persistence. That's the real inheritance." She didn't say much back. She just smiled, the way people do when a compliment lands somewhere deeper than the words themselves. I've thought a lot, since all of this happened, about how quiet the truth actually was the whole time. It never shouted. It never demanded to be noticed. It sat patiently in old emails, in public records, in a tackle box on a closet shelf, waiting for someone stubborn enough to go looking. The truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs someone willing to listen for it. These days, my Sundays look different than they used to. Fuller in some ways, quieter in others. Denise is still finding her way back, slowly, imperfectly, and I've stopped needing her to rush it. What I have now is enough. A small apartment, a granddaughter who never stopped asking questions, and an old tackle box that turned out to hold far more than either of us ever expected. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that family isn't proven by who manages your paperwork. It's proven by who still shows up asking real questions when it actually matters. Inheritance isn't just what you leave behind, it's who you trusted enough to protect it. I want to thank you for staying with my story all the way to the end. Things with Denise aren't fully resolved, and I've made peace with that. Healing doesn't require erasing consequences. It just requires making room for both to exist at once. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments. Write out that line if it stuck with you, that inheritance is about who you trusted enough to protect it. If you believe quiet persistence beats loud excuses every time, give this video a like. Subscribe if you want more stories like mine. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, someone who's ever felt dismissed, overlooked, or quietly pushed aside by the people who were supposed to protect them, share it with them. Sometimes the truth takes its time, but it always finds someone willing to listen.